Hi everyone, my name is Anastasiia Lapatina and you're watching This Week in Ukraine, a new video podcast from the Kyiv Independent. Every week, I sit down with some of my newsroom colleagues to discuss Ukraine's most pressing issues. And this time, we're talking about the issue of corruption in Ukraine, how it manifests in Ukraine's judicial system, and whether holding people in power accountable became harder after Russia's full-scale invasion. I'm joined by the Kyiv Independent reporter Oleg Sukhov, who's covered corruption in Ukraine for many years. Oleg, welcome to the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
So on the night of May 26th, there was a terrible car accident in Kyiv. A 22-year-old soldier of the National Guard who was on duty at a roadblock was hit and killed instantly by a drunk driver. And the story matters to us because that drunk driver was actually a judge. He was the head of a district court in Makariv, a city in Kyiv suburbs. And according to the De Jure Foundation, which is a corruption watchdog, this judge, Oleg Sukhov, actually helped a different judge avoid any responsibility for drunk driving, also back in 2021, by closing his case, essentially. So naturally, the Ukrainian society was really upset about this whole situation because it highlights a certain pattern, a pattern of corruption and impunity within the judicial system in Ukraine. So I want to start by talking about that broadly. How widespread is this issue of corruption within Ukraine's judicial bodies, and where did it originate?
Basically, corruption exists in all countries, but there are big differences. So in the West, corruption is mostly an exception to the rule. And whenever something happens that implicates someone in corruption, that person faces criminal charges, or at least resigns or is fired. Mm-hmm. But in Ukraine, it's different because it's kleptocracy. So the corruption is the rule, and the lack of corruption is an exception. So in Ukraine, when some corruption scandal happens, usually nothing happens. There are also exceptions, but corruption is so widespread that it has become sort of the normal state of society, the normal state of the political system. It's not just Ukraine. There are other former Soviet countries like this. A system that is completely immune to corruption is impossible. But in the West, the political culture is totally different. There is no tolerance for corruption. In Ukraine, the tolerance for corruption is pretty high. And there is no political will to fight corruption.
You mentioned the Soviet Union. Is that connected to how widespread corruption is here in Ukraine?
Yes, it's part of the reason why corruption is so widespread. The Soviet system itself, it was corrupt, but it's the reason why former Soviet countries are corrupt is that the political culture, the level of the political culture is pretty low. There is no proper separation of powers. There is no proper independent judiciary. Mm-hmm. You know, countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union do not have a long tradition of responsible government, transparent government. So it's very different from the West, where some countries have had that tradition for many centuries.
Right. You mentioned the judiciary, and I assume it's especially bad when your judiciary is corrupt, because that's kind of like the part of the government that has to hold corrupt officials accountable. So, you know, you can have maybe oligarchs or businessmen or politicians that are very corrupt. But if you also have courts that are corrupt, then it's just a cycle. There is no way out of it in a way.
Well, yeah, it's true. The judiciary, in some ways, it's the most important branch of government. So since there can be no rule of law, no justice without an independent and fair and just judiciary. And while Ukraine is a democracy, so there are regular elections, basically and elections are pretty competitive, But on the other hand, there is no independent and fair judiciary, which makes this democracy pretty flawed. So, and that's why Ukraine has failed so far to become like a stable Western-style democracy. So, and there have been many efforts to, or alleged efforts to carry out judicial reform, but in my opinion, they have mostly failed.
Despite everything that you just said, Ukraine actually has several unique, pretty impressive anti-corruption bodies, because it sounds like it's a whole infrastructure. There are at least 4 of them. So tell us about them.
Well, there are several institutions that were created after the Euromaidan revolution. So the NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, the SAPO, it's the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, the High Anti-Corruption Court, and also the National Agency for Corruption Prevention. Mm-hmm. So Yanukovych's corrupt regime, was opposed by the revolutionaries. So and there was big demand in society for fundamental change. Mm-hmm. That was one of the reasons why these institutions were created. Another reason was that the West was pushing for their creation when Ukraine became more Western-oriented after the Euromaidan revolution. Mm-hmm. But the reforms, they have only had very limited success, since these agencies have managed to bring charges against some, petty officials, maybe mid-level officials. But they were actually created not to fight some like petty corruption. They were created to fight big corruption, top-level corruption. And in my opinion, in that regard, they have failed, because some relatively powerful officials have been charged. No one has been convicted or jailed among big officials, top officials. And so basically, when the agencies were created, they were supposed to be independent from the president, independent from the executive branch, but in fact, they are not. So the NABU and the SAPO have been dependent on presidents, unfortunately. And that's why they were reluctant to go after presidential allies.
So you've mentioned that kind of the idea was to create independent anti-corruption bodies. How is that different from what Ukraine has had before they were created? Did we have any bodies like that before at all?
So before that, most of the law enforcement agencies were subordinated to the president, although there are different opinions on what this entails, because I've heard the opinion that this view that law enforcement agencies should be independent does not work in reality, at least in Ukraine. So this opinion is that if the president is corrupt and if his inner circle is corrupt, then the voters will elect someone else. So and he takes full responsibility for all these corrupt law enforcement bodies.
Right.
And maybe that's how it should work, according to this opinion. Yanukovych was obviously corrupt, and then he was replaced by Poroshenko, then Zelensky was elected. But instead of actually taking political responsibility, they sort of created this facade, these allegedly independent agencies, and then when the fight against corruption failed, they could just say that, okay, it's not us, it's these independent agencies. We are not to blame for this. We have nothing to do with anti-corruption efforts. They're supposed to be independent.
Right.
So maybe it was part of this, part of this game, part of this bluff. But there is also another opinion according to which these agencies should be independent, completely independent, in order to go after presidential allies and not to be afraid of some retribution from the president, from the president's office. I think if it's possible, that would be a great system. I think in Romania, something like this has been created when Laura Kövesi has created a very successful anti-corruption agency that jailed a lot of important officials. But let's see if it works in Ukraine. So far, it has not worked. So far, these agencies have been a little bit more independent than law enforcement agencies under Yanukovych, but there is no complete independence, and they're still afraid of going after presidential allies. They're still engaged in imitation rather than some real fight against corruption.
There has also been a lot of noise about Ukraine's judicial reform and it allegedly being close to failure. And this is interesting because this reform was also initiated around the time after Euromaidan, but it's kind of still ongoing. So tell us, what is the main idea of this reform, and also why so many years later we're still talking about it?
So after the Euromaidan revolution, there have been many so-called judicial reforms, many attempts at reform. So under Poroshenko, there were several attempts to create judicial bodies that were supposed to be, again, independent from the executive branch, and they were supposed to meet integrity and ethics standards and to consist of honest and professional people. Mm-hmm. Under Poroshenko, all these reforms failed since I think there was no political will. So Poroshenko was interested in creating a judiciary that was loyal to him. He was not interested in judicial independence. Actually, in the world, very few governments are interested in courts that are independent from them.
And when you say failed, why was that? Was that in practice? Was it stalled somehow by the government, or what actually happened?
Well, basically, there were two factors. It was the interests of the president, of the executive branch, which were not interested in judicial reform, so they intentionally sabotaged it. And there were also the interests of the judicial mafia, the corrupt judges who are still running the show. They're still very powerful and very influential. So since the bodies that were supposed to carry out the reform were they were formed by corrupt judges, and they consisted mostly of corrupt judges. Mm-hmm. Failure was the inevitable result.
Right.
And when all these efforts failed, when Zelensky was elected, one of his promises was to relaunch this botched judicial reform. And again, under Zelensky, there have been also several attempts to carry out judicial reform. And I think in terms of their success, they're pretty similar to Poroshenko, because the difference was that now, under pressure from the West and from civil society, the authorities were kind of forced to invite foreign experts who participated in this judicial reform.
And what do you mean by that? What kind of process is happening
so
there?
Basically, there are two top judicial bodies that appoint and fire judges, mm-hmm. and foreign experts, along with Ukrainian judges, were supposed to choose mm-hmm. New members of these top judicial bodies. And these new members were supposed to be honest and professional again. The problem was that I think this judicial mafia managed to trick and to manipulate the foreign experts and to persuade them to basically do everything they want. So when one of these top judicial bodies, the High Council of Justice, was created, when new members of this council were elected, there was a big scandal when well-known whistleblower judge Larissa Golnik was vetoed by the selection panel, which included foreign experts, while several very controversial and tainted candidates were actually allowed to become members of the judicial body. So, and it just showed that there was not much difference between this reform and the reform under Poroshenko. Now there is a new contest going on for another top judicial body, the High Qualification Commission, also with the participation of foreign experts. And again, there are several controversies. One of them is that several very well-known candidates were just vetoed, were kicked out of the contest. And these candidates have been praised by civil society. They have shown their determination to carry out reform, but I think they were actually vetoed for this exact reason that they were against the judicial mafia. So the judicial mafia kicked them out.
Are these foreign experts explaining that somehow?
Well, I sent a request to the selection panel, which includes foreign experts, and the explanation was just like a formality, some formal excuse, basically that we think we are doing everything right, that so the candidates that were approved are professional and good, and the candidates that were kicked out are not, something like that. So there were no details, no specifics.
So you mentioned the judicial mafia. So I think here it's really worth mentioning what was arguably Ukraine's biggest case ever of judicial corruption, the case of Pavlo Vovk, who was likely the most notorious corrupt judge in the country. So tell us about that case.
Pavlo Vovk was very controversial because he headed one of the most important courts. There was the Kyiv Administrative District Court.
Why was it important?
Because it basically, this court rules on issues linked to the top government bodies located in Kyiv. And it had a lot of authority, and this authority allowed Vovk basically to be engaged in corruption because there were very big issues at stake. And Vovk and his associates were implementing some very big corruption schemes thanks to the authority. Initially, I think it was 2019, Vovk was charged with obstruction of justice and corruption, and he was charged with interfering in the work of several government bodies illegally, and he was recorded on audio tape, and his associates were recorded, and those recordings contained a lot of evidence of alleged corruption and illegal schemes and other crimes. But unfortunately, the whole law enforcement system was focused on saving Vovk. So it was, when he was charged, the charges were brought by a very outspoken investigator, Gorbatyuk. Actually, the case was initiated by him. I mean, formally the charges were brought by a different body, but basically he was behind the initial stage of this case. But apart from this, isolated investigators who were actually who were focused on punishing Vovk, the rest of the law enforcement system was focused on saving him. The top judicial bodies, the Prosecutor General's office, and the SBU, the Security Service of Ukraine, did everything in their power to actually whitewash Vovk and not to jail him.
And what do you mean by whitewash? What did they actually do?
The High Council of Justice, the top judicial body, refused to suspend Vovk or to fire him.
And he continued being a judge.
Yeah, he's still a judge, actually. Also, some investigative procedures like searches were also blocked by the Prosecutor General's office.
On what grounds?
I don't even remember how they explained it, formally. But it was obviously they didn't want to go after Vovk because Vovk is connected to a lot of top officials, and there is evidence that he was connected to the president's office. And that he was a very convenient judge for the authorities, so they didn't want to punish him. They wanted to use him for their own purposes. And also several times deadlines were missed for sending the Vovk case to trial, and I think they were missed intentionally.
Very convenient.
Yeah, just to basically not to jail him and to keep him on the leash and to keep him as a convenient and politically loyal judge who would do some favors to the authorities.
And where is that case now? Because the court was disbanded, right? That was a pretty big scandal in Ukraine too.
Yeah, the court has been formally liquidated, although Vovk is no longer the chairman of this court because it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
But he's still formally a judge.
Wait, so he's a judge formally by documents, or he's working in a different court now?
He's not working in different courts, but he's basically like a judge without a court.
Mm-hmm.
And he's getting a big salary. And the case against him is still being considered by the High Anti-Corruption Court, but there has been no progress for a lot of time.
There were also several big revelations about judges and their links to Russia. So judges straight up having like passports of the Russian Federation, having family members in Russia, and some of these judges even served in Ukraine's Supreme Court, so the highest court in the land.
Yes, so one of the biggest cases was the case, was basically the Russian citizenship of Bogdan Lvov, a former deputy chairman of the Supreme Court.
That's huge.
So he was the second in command at the Supreme Court. And I remember that several years ago, I think it was still under Poroshenko, I wrote about Lvov's alleged corruption. And he was actually investigated for allegedly receiving a bribe, and there was a lot of information implicating him in alleged corruption. But nobody paid any attention, and nobody cared about this. He was not fired or punished at that time. And
there were no cases against him.
There were some investigations, but there were no formal charges brought against him. Mm-hmm. So I'm pretty sure that a lot of people knew about his Russian citizenship, and it's actually pretty common among, I think, Ukrainian judges, because some of them actually worked in Russia in the early 90s.
Right.
So I know some cases when they worked in Russia in the early 90s, and then they moved to Ukraine. And they didn't get rid of their Russian citizenship.
They can say that it's all innocent and doesn't really matter.
Yeah. And Lvov, but it's actually banned by Ukrainian law. So
that's illegal.
If you're talking about the issue of double citizenship, it's complicated. But if you are an official or a judge, it's definitely banned. So you can't be a judge and at the same time a Russian citizen. Mm-hmm. So and Lvov, he was fired only after a big scandal happened during the full-scale Russian invasion. And if no invasion had happened, probably he would still remain a deputy chairman. And this just shows that it's very dangerous to ignore evidence of corruption and evidence of wrongdoing, because before the invasion, when I wrote about it and many others wrote about it, about alleged illegal schemes involving Lvov, nobody paid attention. And after the invasion began, it became a security risk.
Right.
And
also a publicity risk.
Yeah.
And have the situation with corruption, both with how much of corruption we have, but then also how actively it's being prosecuted, has that changed after Russia's full-scale invasion?
I would say in some ways it has changed for the worse, because the war is always a convenient excuse for corrupt officials. So basically, if there's a war going on, so we will hide all the information from Putin, from the Kremlin, but in fact they're hiding it from their own compatriots, from the people of Ukraine, from the law enforcement system. So it provided a very convenient excuse for the authorities to shut down public access to asset declarations. And asset declarations were one of the main methods of punishing officials, because if you find out some information about ill-gotten wealth about some assets that were acquired illegally, then it's grounds for a criminal case. But now, since there is no public access, and also officials are not even required to file asset declarations at all. So it's this system has been completely destroyed.
And what's the official reason for doing that?
Well, the official reason at the beginning of the invasion was security. So,
security.
While at the very beginning, maybe there was some, some explanation for this when Russian troops were near Kyiv. Basically, that officials could not even, physically file asset declarations. One could argue.
Okay. Yeah.
And also allegedly, when that Russian intelligence agencies could find out some information.
Addresses.
Yeah, addresses from asset declarations. But on the other hand, actually, it's not necessary to write addresses in them. It's just what is important is the facts themselves. Is the list of assets, how many square meters, etc. Yeah. So I think even though there might have been some valid grounds for it at the very beginning of the invasion, after that it became more of an excuse, and now it's completely inappropriate.
But at the same time, there have been some what looked like genuine attempts at persecuting corrupt officials, like the case of Kniazev, right?
Well, it still remains to be seen whether this is a genuine attempt, because Vsevolod Kniazev, the chairman of the Supreme Court, has been charged with basically taking a $3 million bribe for a ruling favorable to businessman, allegedly favorable to businessman Konstantin Zhivago. So when Kniazev was elected and other candidates were elected as judges of the Supreme Court under Poroshenko, there were many scandals, and anti-corruption activists were complaining about candidates who did not meet integrity standards, who were considered corrupt, but they were appointed nonetheless. And this is the result. And this is the result, and it also shows, I think, that this judicial reform is a facade and a fig leaf, because Kniazev was actually pretending to be sort of a reformer. He was trying to meet, foreign experts, foreign delegates. He was trying to show them how good the Ukrainian judiciary is. And this is again the result, and this shows how much of a facade all this is. So,
but he was caught, and what's happening with the case now?
Well, now it's too early to say. It's now we'll have to see how this case will be considered by the courts, and I think we should at least wait until it's sent to trial. And sometimes such cases are never sent to trial.
You've also mentioned that there have been some cases of success with our new anti-corruption bodies in Ukraine. There haven't been any top officials charged, but some lower fish has been. Tell us about those stories of success.
So, I would call them like very limited success, like sort of baby steps, because they, I think it just depends on what your priorities are. It's better to be Ukraine than North Korea. If your standard is to be better than North Korea, then there has been success. But if your standard is to be as good as, Switzerland, then it's not a success story. So that's
it really depends.
So basically, I think that there have been several officials who have faced corruption charges, like a former head of the fiscal service, of the tax service, Nasirov. Also an influential former member of parliament, Martynenko. Kniazev has been mentioned already. Also Alexander Granovsky, who was a member of parliament under Poroshenko, who was very close to Poroshenko and was accused of being involved in corruption schemes. He also has been charged. And there are some other cases like this. But one problem is that they have faced charges, but they have not been sentenced yet. They have not been convicted. So the Nazirov case and the Martinenko case is still continuing. They're still going on, and there is no end in sight.
Mm-hmm.
So, and if we're talking about convictions, the rate of the conviction rate for the high anti-corruption court is somewhat higher than for the previous period before the anti-corruption court was created. So much more petty judges and like mid-level officials have been sentenced. It's true. So this, if that can be considered success, that is, an example.
We now have a very exciting announcement. The Kyiv Independent finally launched its very own membership system. We know that some of you guys have been waiting for this for a long time, to support us directly without intermediaries like Patreon, and you can very easily do that now. Just go to our website, kyivindependent.com. Our supporters still get all the same perks, like access to exclusive events and the ability to send us in questions before every single episode of the podcast. And all supporters also get access to a Discord server where you guys can submit questions to us, and we try to participate as much as possible to chat with you and also talk within the community as well. And we've got some really good questions this time. So the first question is, what work does Ukraine need to do, corruption-wise, to get into the European Union? Is there a specific roadmap? And does Ukraine have a roadmap to support this?
Well, the European Union has some requirements, like, for example, I think it's kind of an informal requirement, but it still matters. It's the restoration of the asset declaration system. So Ukraine needs to restore this system, and officials will have to start filing declarations again. There were also some requirements that have been fulfilled already, like formally, from the formal standpoint. I think they have been failures, but if we're talking about like formal criteria, then the chief anti-corruption prosecutor has been appointed, and the head of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau has been appointed.
So those are chiefs of SAPO and NABU, right?
Yeah. So I think there were a lot of problems with the appointments of the head of the NABU, but formally this requirement has been fulfilled, because one of the demands was the completion of judicial reform. And again, formally, it's actually close to completion. And the Ukrainian authorities may just say that, okay, we're done. We're done. We did everything that was required. They can also cite the participation of foreign experts, But de facto, it's a failure in many aspects.
Another question was, after regarding what appears to be continuing corruption on a large scale, even during war, the supporter was wondering if Ukrainians believe that Zelensky is also corrupt. This is an interesting and a bit of a tricky question.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the Ukrainians are very different. I mean, you can't just say that all the Ukrainians believe something.
Do we have any stats?
Probably, but I would need to look them up. But based on my experience, obviously there are people in Ukraine who think he's corrupt. There are people who think he's not corrupt. I would say probably the majority does not think he's corrupt.
The majority did elect him.
Because they elected him, and then he got a boost because of the full-scale invasion, like this sort of wartime presidency. Mm-hmm. And it's much more common to blame low-level officials, because there is still this sort of, I think, naive idea that the president is some kind of sacred figure who is immune to corruption or crime, which I think is not true. I mean, they think that, for example, the chief of staff, the prime minister, they may be corrupt, but Zelensky himself, he just doesn't know about it or something like that. But on the other hand, even if that is the case, if he allows his chief of staff and his prime minister to be corrupt, then it's also his responsibility, even if he himself is not corrupt. He's politically responsible for that, and he must fire them, the top officials involved in corruption, and he must ensure that they're prosecuted and jailed.
I mean, I've also noticed that we definitely have a pro-Zelensky and a pro-Poroshenko camp. So the pro-Poroshenko camp is definitely super active in accusing Zelensky of all sort of corruption. But I think moving beyond that, on the side of maybe more unbiased and balanced looking part of the population, the civil society, the activists who kind of, don't support one president or the other, I think there is no mythical thinking that Zelensky is somehow absorbed from corruption or his administration is absorbed from corruption. We all kind of know that there are problems, and some people choose to voice it very actively, some don't, but there are definitely no myths that he's absolved from responsibility.
Yeah, in civil society, because civic activists, they are usually more educated and more knowledgeable, so obviously they don't have such mythology.
Well, Oleg, thank you so much. It was really interesting to listen to you.
Thank you too.
Also this week, on May 29th and 30th, Russia launched 3 mass attacks on Kyiv within 24 hours, using ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as dozens of Shahed drones. Debris from the intercepted weapons fell on civilian structures in several areas around Kyiv and Kyiv Oblast. 1 person was killed, and at least 15 were injured. Also on May 30th, Moscow and its suburbs were hit also by a drone attack. Some drones were intercepted, while some flew into residential buildings. No casualties were reported. The Kremlin accused Ukraine of conducting the attack, but Kyiv denied any involvement. And Ukraine's defense ministry reported that Russia is increasingly losing initiative in its war against Ukraine, meaning that the Kremlin is mostly reacting to Kyiv's actions, rather than independently pursuing its own military goals. You can find our show on YouTube and all audio platforms every Friday morning. If you like this episode, please subscribe to us and like our content wherever you're listening to this podcast. Also, make sure to check out the Kyiv Independent's new project, Ukraine's True History, which is a series of YouTube videos and articles about Ukrainian history, which has been distorted by Russia for centuries. Also, become a member of the Kyiv Independent community and support us by going on our website, kyivindependent.com, and follow us on social media on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We'll be back next week. Thank you for watching.